Welcome, everybody. All right. So we are happy to have so many people here today participating in our panel discussion on building a funded, qualitative, community-engaged research agenda. Please note we are recording today's presentation. I would like to give a warm welcome and thank you to our panelists for taking the time to be here and for sharing their expertise and lessons learned on this topic. I'm Candace Christensen. My pronouns are they, them. I'm an associate professor with the University of Texas at San Antonio in the Department of Social Work, and I'm facilitating our event today. Before we get started, I would like to share Zoom etiquette guidelines. Please keep yourself on mute unless you're asking a question during the Q&A period. The last 30 minutes of our time will be dedicated to attendee questions. Will be dedicated to attendee questions for the panelists. According to Janice Morse, the founding editor of Qualitative Health Research, we are experiencing a surge of interest in qualitative, community-engaged research that is unprecedented. This is due to advances in equipment that makes collecting and analyzing these types of data easier than ever. This is also due to advances in theoretical perspectives on what constitutes knowledge and whom should be producing knowledge. We're also experiencing rapidly changing social conditions and that community members are documenting through photos, videos, audio recordings, and social media. Also, funding agencies are increasingly wanting to see research projects improve the material conditions of communities involved with the research. Given this wave of interest in qualitative, community-engaged research, this event aims to provide support to faculty and graduate students who wish to develop skills and a research agenda that is community-engaged and utilizes qualitative methodologies. Our three panelists come from a diverse range of disciplines, have all utilized qualitative methods in their research, and successfully obtained funding to support this research. Now I am happy to have each of our panelists introduce themselves at this time. Dr. NALINI NEGI.
Hi, thank you for the invitation from UT San Antonio, in particular, Dr. Christensen. I also want to give a shout out to my dear friend, Dr. Amy Chumagum, that is here. For the graduate students that are on this, I want to highlight the critical importance of building solidarity and community with people in your doctoral program. Amy and I were doctoral students together at UT Austin and remain dear friends to this day. She just did the Longhorn side. And I have some graduate students from our program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, that I see here, Nikita Agarwal and Maura Tenner. So thank you for being here, as well as others. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about the work that I've been doing and engaged in, but more excited to hear about your questions and any way that I can help shape your thinking and strategies regarding qualitative work. As I mentioned a little earlier, I'm at the University of Maryland in Baltimore at the School of Social Work. I'm an associate professor, and my work has mainly focused on specifically Latino immigrant, low-wage workers, day laborers in particular, who are employed in the informal economy. And I've used ethnographic methods to elucidate factors associated to their psychological well-being, including behavioral health and HIV-related risk behavior. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as we move along. So excited to be here.
Dr. Deborah Medina.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Deborah Medina. I'm at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm a professor in Mexican American and Latino studies, and I also am director of the Latino Research Institute. Even though I'm in an ethnic studies department, I'm formally trained as an epidemiologist, and I also have a degree in health promotion. So I mix the qualitative and the quantitative. So I consider myself more of a mixed methods person. I also am engaged in intervention research with Latino communities. So a lot of the work that I do, I collaborate with community partners to identify issues in the community and come up with solutions. And then we try to test them and see how they work. So I'm a participatory researcher. And my focus is primarily Hispanic families and preventing chronic disease.
Dr. Amy Stone.
Hi, my name is Dr. Amy Stone. I am a full professor of sociology and anthropology at Trinity University in San Antonio. It's a liberal arts college. My research is mostly on the kind of LGBTQ community in the US, particularly in the South and Southwest, particularly in Texas. My main community-based research project has been the Strengthening Colors of Pride project, which I've done in collaboration with the Pride Center here in San Antonio. I'm going to put a link in the chat. I do mostly qualitative research, but I can do like kind of basic surveys, and I led like a community-wide survey that we did along with the report we wrote up for it. So I can do up to like t-tests and crosstabs, right? Essentially, which you can do a lot with those. So I've been funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and National Science Foundation.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here. Now we're going to start our panel discussion, and I will ask our first question. What do each of you see as the primary facilitators to building a qualitative, community-engaged research funding agenda? Open to all panelists.
I'm going to start with one element that I think is really important, which is a really clear like reciprocal relationship with the community leaders that you're working with, making sure that you have kind of some similar things you're interested in or similar aims. Like I've seen researchers come in and be like, I want to do community-based research on this thing that I really care about, right? And the community leader is not as interested, right? They're kind of coming along for the ride, but like it's not one of their priorities. And I've also seen community organizations that are that have some very specific things that they need to know for their own programming or grant writing that are not of interest or can't be analyzed in a way that'll ultimately help the researcher. The researcher like needs to write refereed articles and they can't on this particular topic, right? So finding a good match, like that kind of matchmaking between yourself and an organization or group or leader or community member, or not like it has to be kind of a good fit. I think that's like a really important thing. Otherwise, community organizations, they get burnt out on being like, all these academics keep coming to us and they like want to recruit people from our organization, but they don't like give anything back. They don't give back the things that we need, right? And then researchers being like, I do all of this stuff that like is not being rewarded by my dissertation committee or by, P&T. So kind of finding a good match is really important, and kind of then building the trust within that match, like having some things that you're kind of both interested in together.
I would agree, building relationships is important, right? So, what is the community, right, that you want to work with? Are you already connected to that community? What's your positionality relative to that community? How are you going to gain entree? And I have moved 3 times in my career and wanting to work with the Hispanic community in California, in South Carolina, and now in Texas. And every context is different. Every community is different. All the assets and resources are different. And while others assumed that I was a Hispanic expert. They're like, tell us all about Hispanics. I'm like, well, I don't know anything about this community, right? I don't live here. We're different class. I'm not an immigrant. So there was just a lots of differences. So the first thing I think was, gaining entree, like introducing yourself to the community, kind of doing ethnographic research, right? Just being present, seeing where they are, what they do, being of service. That's at least how I started, is offering my expertise kind of in a kind of pro bono way. It's like, I'm here, these are my skills, let me know if I can help. And through time, when opportunities, say for example, funding happen where the agenda maybe is driven by the funder, the community is more apt to then support you, because over time you've been supporting them. So they're willing to maybe expand maybe their space to kind of let you come in.
Yeah, so just building off of what Dr. Stone and PARRA-MEDINA just mentioned, and going a little bit back, I think for me, one of the main sort of roots is thinking through the question. What is the question that you have? And does it really align well to qualitative methods? Is it really a place where you want to know more, right? That you don't have a hypothesis. So I think that's a really sort of critical point to the start of a qualitative program of research. And then I think in terms of value and reminding yourself of this sort of importance of curiosity and importance of wanting to know more, right? I think those are critical sort of pieces. In terms of building community engaged or participatory work, the critical sort of pieces there are, again, what Dr. Stone and Dr. PARRA-MEDINA indicated, is building relationships of trust, right? Indicating to whatever community that you're seeking entree to, that you are somebody that is reliable and trustworthy and somebody who is worth having a relationship with. I think those are critical pieces. I also go back early in my own doctoral program, and I remember clearly, I did this Summer Research Institute, which, by the way, for the graduate students that are on here, if there are summer research institutes that are geared towards your area of interest, I would highly, highly recommend that you do those. They're so impactful, and they've been very impactful in the trajectory of my thinking and my work. But as I was doing Summer Research Training Institute, and I was indicating as a doctoral student what my interests were, I was interested in transmigration. I was interested in the concept of what it meant to live lives between multiple borders. And I was asked by one of the faculty advisors there, do you really know, above and beyond what you're seeing in the literature, what is going on with these men that you're interested in learning more about, in terms of, are you having conversations with them? And that was such an important question that led me into really working with the organization that was working with day laborers in Austin, and just being part of this sort of organization, working on advocacy issues, going to street corners and talking to day laborers about wage theft and organizing in that sort of way. And it gave me a really deeper understanding that was above and beyond what was in the literature, because the literature at that point was very scant, despite the notable work of Abel Valenzuela and Kurt Organista. So I think those are good, important points to start off with. Sorry that I keep on glitching. I see myself glitching. I don't know if others are seeing that too. I'm in the matrix.
You're in the matrix.
I wanted to add, because a part of the question is related to a funding agenda, right? And so I was thinking about, why do qualitative methodologists need funding? And when it comes down to it, I think time, right? One thing that is needed with qualitative research is, one is as an individual PI and researcher, you're in direct connection, right, with the participants of the research, and you need time in order to conduct the research and gather the information, do these relationships. So there's time in terms of your day-to-day obligations at the university, right? Like everybody has a full teaching load and service commitments and these sorts of things. So how do you get time release to be able to do the work? But then there's also time prospectively, right? Especially if you're on the tenure track or you're trying to finish your PhD. How do you do the work in such, or plan the work in such a way that you're producing products that are going to help in terms of your research agenda, but also in terms of your completing your dissertation or getting promoted in tenure. So I think time is a really important part of why I seek funding, so that I can release myself from teaching, or I don't have to worry about teaching extra in the summer, to fund students to support me. So I think thinking about why you need funding is important. And just having been on TNP committees in now 3 institutions, when it comes down to it, the amount of funding, like in the dollars, doesn't turn out to be the biggest issue in my perspective. Because some disciplines, you get a $15,000 fellowship and that's a huge prize, versus the NIH trials, which are millions of dollars, right? But the funding is proportionate to the need, right? So I think the most important thing is you get funding to have the resources you need to do the work. But what really matters is the outcomes, right? Do you have something to show for the investments that the funders made, and products, presentations and papers? So making sure that you have these, when you develop your plan, right, that you know what sorts of products you're going to get out of it. That's very pragmatic, but I just was thinking about that in terms of the funding question and how important time is.
I want to piggyback on that with funding. Like for me, in order to get funding, I had to show that I had a team, right? Because very few funders are just interested in like you solo person, like doing, unless they're like an early career award, right? Where they're like investing in you as a person to do your things. So even if that team, even if you're like, well, I'm just a grad student, I don't have a team, right? It might be another graduate student. It might be undergrads who want to help with your project, right? Even one undergraduate student doing a 1-credit independent study with you for the semester is a team, right? So in terms of like, and I always think about like what people on that team, like where their strengths are. So for example, for qualitative, like community-based work, we do all these interviews, we get all of these stories. And yes, I'm the one who sits down and like does a lot of the writing of those into like referee journal articles. Like sometimes I have other people helping, but like ultimately I'm the one who has to like shepherd that process. It's such an idiosyncratic thing. But my students are the ones who take the stories and turn them into like, we've done meme campaigns around like Pride Month, right? Where they take some of the stories and some of the wisdom from our interviews and turn them into memes. I don't like to make memes. I don't want to spend hours and hours of my time doing that. They love doing it. And it's a way of kind of giving that back to our community organization to be like, like here's a way of like kind of talking about the stories in a way that's not like, here, read a whole bunch of stuff. Like a lot of people don't like to read, right? So kind of figure out how to do that. We've had it turn into zines. We've had it turn into videos, right? They want to turn some stuff into TikToks. Great, right? So that's their strength. Like they're really good at that. So try to build a team and think really broadly about what kinds of help you might need for a community-based research project, right? That help might be just little kinds of help that are, that's one less thing I have to do is make that infographic, right? Like, because they're really good at that. I just have to kind of like supervise that thing. And that's just somebody working 2 or 3 hours a week on this project. So kind of thinking a little bit like, who's my team? you know? And then like, what is the strengths of everyone on that team? And are there people that I actively need to recruit into that team? You know, that things that I don't know how to do photo voice, right? Like, so maybe I need to know somebody who like knows more about photography or like the arts, or, you know, like maybe I need someone, right? I need to go build that network. Because when you fill out your funding application, a lot of funders, they want to fund a team, right? They want team research. And they also want you to have some kind of previous working relationship. So it's kind of tricky if you've like never been funded before and now you're like applying for this huge, sometimes 3-year-long grant, right? You need to show that you have a working relationship and collaboration. And that could just be that like you worked on something really minor for like, you know, like a month, right? But you need to have some kind of working relationship. You also need to assess whether or not this is someone you really want to work with, right? I hire a lot of undergrads we have a really strong summer research program. Even though I work at like a predominantly undergrad institution, I hire them all the time to work for me full-time in the summer through Trinity funding or other funding. And because I got a lot of Trinity funding to do that, now when I apply for grants, I get grant funding to guarantee that I can have those students for the summer, because I've shown that I have a history of doing that. So start really small, you know, in your team building with like little tiny pockets of money that are at your institution. Grants, big grants, want to fund people who have other grants. So I just got an NSF and an RWJF, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant, one for community-based research and one for a longitudinal study I'm doing on LGBTQ youth and extended family and housing stability with my colleague Brandon Robinson at UCR. We're actually in the middle of applying for like yet more grants to continue the project, essentially, right? So we have funding to follow these youth for 14 months once we recruit them into the study, and we want to turn it into a 3-year project. Why are we applying right now? Funders love people who have funding. It's kind of ironic. Instead of saying like, oh, look, like here's all these people who don't have money. That person has tons of money, they're fine. Instead, they want to fund somebody who has a funding history, right? So even if you just apply for, if you're just on as a researcher, so like there's a grant right now that the Pride Center has through Metropolitan Health. They put me on as just a researcher, like a contract researcher on that job. Very early on, that would have been a really good gig for me, because I could say like, look, I was funded with the Pride Center on this project, right? Helping them evaluate a program that they're doing, right? So little tiny pockets of money lead to big money, right? So you have to show like, so even if you're like, oh, this is only like a $500 grant, doesn't matter. Like you're showing that you know how to apply for a grant, you get like feedback. Sometimes you kind of learn how to work the system, and you show that you can like build that team. And that you have like an outcome from each of those grants, even if it's just like, here's a 2-page white paper we wrote on it, right?
Yeah, and I think a critical element of all that too is knowing how to write the grant, right? And basically what that means is building the case for the significance of your study, the significance of your research question. Why should somebody care? Is it some sort of like idiosyncratic thing that you seem to be really interested in, or does it have a larger public health impact, social justice impact, impact? Like, what is the significance of it? And then thinking about the innovation of it, like what is the innovation of your methods, right? Those are important skills to start developing. In terms of the significance, that can be quite challenging because you know why you're interested, right? But having the words to articulate why exactly others should care is an important exercise. So I always recommend, and I do this myself as well, is that I build the case for significance, but then I have others ask me and push holes or into the sort of my rationale for the significance. And by pushing holes into it, then it helps me build the case in a better sort of stronger sort of way. And it's really critical here that I underscore that writing for manuscripts or writing for publications is very, very different than writing for a grant. And if there's any sort of grant writing program or or even mentorship with other people who can, give you a successful grant proposal, and then you can think that through, and then they can help build your grant is really, really critical. And even for people who are seasoned grant writers, feedback is such an important piece to it. I always say, like, sometimes I know there's people who shy away from critical engagement in their work, but as an academician and as a scholar, I always invite that. The more critical a person is with my work, the better it usually becomes. Even comments sometimes that I feel like are like, what? I thought it was pretty clear, but it gives me, I take a pause. You can be a little bit like, okay, but then take a little bit of a pause and think about why they may have said what they said and try to, maybe perhaps clarify what you were saying. With a grant, you want to catch the reviewer's attention, and you want to be like, pow, pow, this is the significance, this is the innovation, etc. In a manuscript, you can tell a longer sort of story. So again, very different skill sets.
I would tag on, I first want to make sure you're done, because I can't always tell on Zoom. Okay. I would also add on that for really big grants, I'm a panelist for some NSF grants, and they don't really believe you are going to do a thing unless you say you're going to do it. Down to, I'm collaborating with someone at UCR. We literally had to write, every week we will have a Zoom meeting for at least an hour. Like they really don't believe, like, how will they communicate? How will they? I don't know. We don't know, right? Like they really don't believe unless you say, like, how we're going to recruit. Like you leave nothing to the imagination, essentially, because that sometimes sinks things. Like I've literally had an NSF that I applied to like years ago, that I was like going to work on a team that we were going to share a folder that would have like all of they're like, how will they have access to the data to analyze it? Your undergrads. I was like, well, I'll do this thing where I share a file with them, right? Like, and they just like click on it, and then they like look at it, and then they can just like read it, right there themselves. And you really had to be explicit. You had to be like, we will have a shared file. It will have these documents in it. They will be anonymized in this way. They will be able to access it from their personal computer. Like, they assume complete incompetence until you prove you are competent, right? And that you have all of these logistics. Even if some of them you're like, well, I think we're going to do it that way, but I'm not sure. Just say you're going to do it, right? Just like this is like your plan, right? So, it like just be really, 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 really specific, and just assume that like, we're going to have a community advisory board. This is who we're going to recruit on it. This is how often we're going to meet. This is some of the things we're going to talk about. This is the person who's going to be in charge of coordinating those meetings, right? Like just like all the little details are super important.
I'm soaking all of this up. Thank you for these responses. I'm going to ask one follow-up question to this. What do you all see as the role of mentorship in sort of facilitating this type of research agenda?
Well, several ways. One is you can build a project that's ancillary, right, or fits within a project that they have, or they might have resources that they can leverage for you. And also, mentors just help with problem solving, somebody to talk to share your ideas with, to direct you maybe to the right funding sources, to make connections, right? That's really important too. Like they have a network, they might be able to leverage connections for you. But some of my early projects, when earlier in my career, were usually done ancillary or within somebody else's project. I still wasn't like a PI of a big project, but I would be able to carve something out that was my own, right? So also when you're doing collaborative research, figure out what is the part that I am contributing, right? And I'm going to have something that I can use to publish or to build my own separate study on after this is completed. So I think that those are some of the opportunities that can be leveraged with more senior mentors.
Yeah, I think oh, go ahead. All right. Yeah, mentoring is such a key piece in any sort of research, really. I think it's really critical. And in very different forms, right? Mentorship can take the form of somebody who's providing you very specific feedback regarding your ideas, then specific feedback, regarding your grant proposal. But mentorship can also be, as Dr. PARRA-MEDINA indicated, people who are well connected in some sort of community or some sort of space that you're wanting entree into. So developing a really good cadre of mentors that are at different types of levels, that are providing you different type of mentorship. And some of the mentorship could also be personal, right? Like you want academic mentors as well that can help you strategize and think through what are good funding opportunities, when are good funding opportunities to apply for, how should you think through if you're in a tenure track position, how should you think through your program of research, when should you take sabbatical, when should you, leave, etc. Those are really sort of critical pieces in there. So just like, any of your academic endeavors, whether you go to for the graduate students, whether you end up at a university setting or a research setting, having a cadre of mentors that are people that you can call upon to build upon your program of research, but your academic trajectory is really, really critical here.
I would add to that, and this feels like kind of a catty piece of advice, only take advice about grants from people who get grants. Right? Like, then this is something that like another academic told me like really early on, and I was like, oh, okay. Like if someone like it doesn't really have like a history of applying to these grant organizations, like they're not always the person to mentor you through that. So for me, when I first applied to NSF, well, actually, when I first applied to NSF, what I did is I went through and I looked at who has gotten it the last 2 years that I know, and then I like asked for their proposal, right? I was like, what does your proposal look like? Do you have any advice about like, kind of how you got the funding, how you dealt with this and that? Like, I didn't know that you could talk to program officers beforehand, right? Which you do. Usually you need to have like a 1 or 2 page statement. This is more true for NSF and NIH because they're public funding. It's not as true for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Like they'll provide some mentoring if it's like an invitation only proposal, but like a lot of private foundations are like, we don't have the time for that. But you can run by a grant proposal, like a 2-page summary of it with a program officer. You can meet with them a couple of months beforehand, right? And you can talk it through with them. And that's can be really, really helpful to get a feel for like, is this like working, right? So there can be mentorship that's not necessarily like your dissertation chair or like the immediate people in your life, right? But it can be people like that you kind of just contact over email or like a program officer that you connect with. If you know someone who's a program officer or like at any of these places, like it's a really good year to apply. People love giving money to their friends. Like, and like, I know it sounds terrible, but if like it's meaningful, right? To do that. I think for me, the best mentorship that I got was I talked to a couple of people who had applied for funding from similar places on the topic that I was interested in, right? So I was like, okay, I don't usually study housing stability, so, like, oh, here's some other folks who kind of do that, or they study like LGBTQ youth. So I like set up like a 1-hour meeting with them. I think it was even a half an hour. I did like a half an hour with Brian Mustansky, who has like tons of funding from NIH and like studies youth. And he gave me like the best feedback on my like 2-page summary of like what I thought my big grant was going to be. So this is for like really, really big grants. And so like having like a little bit of like a short version of that grant that you can like workshop around to people is worth your time before you jump into like, I'm going to spend a bazillion hours like writing this really, really long proposal and then like sending it in. Right. So like workshopping with people who like have applied to that grant before, who've applied to that funder before, who knows kind of what the reviewers like maybe critiqued on theirs, even if they applied to it and they like didn't get it. ask if you can see their reviews, which is a little tender, but that might help you figure out like what are some of the priorities of the people who run that grant. Also, my program office, like as a liberal arts college, it's usually one person. It's usually one person. I know them. They know me. They know what I'm researching right now. I let them know when I'm thinking of applying for a thing, and we kind of like work it out together. And they often, if I give them enough time, will read through my stuff and give me feedback, and that's super, super helpful.
This is incredibly helpful information. Thank you.
One thing I wanted to add to that is, one, proposals usually have to be revised and resubmitted several times. I'm an NIH researcher primarily, so I couldn't tell you how to fund, get funding for NSF, but NIH, no problem. So it usually takes at least 2 up to 3 times, sometimes even more. I was recently collaborating with a colleague who submitted it 7 times. And I told him, I said, this is it. If it doesn't go this time, it's just not going to happen. They just don't want to fund it, right? It's just like they were nitpicking. And it was the impact. It's like, they just don't like the idea, or else they would have funded it by now. But anyways, it did end up getting funded. But the other thing is, unlike manuscripts where you have to tell the editor that this is not being considered in any other venue, that's not true with grant proposals. So you can actually pitch your idea at the same time to a variety of outlets. And now you can't get funded for the same idea by 2. If it so happens that you do get funded by multiples, then you have to look at things like overlap or pick one versus the other. But you're not limited to only having your concept being evaluated or under consideration with one potential funding source.
In fact, I would like to piggyback on that. I would say that if you're going to write like a huge proposal, like anytime I do that, I also look at like what else is due like in the next couple of months, and I just like chop it up and like send it to a bunch of other places. Sometimes you can end up with a bunch of little stuff that'll help a project start, like as a pilot or whatever, before it becomes like a really, really big grant.
Yeah, and I like the idea of the concept paper to discuss, before you start the process of writing the whole proposal, and so that's a really critical piece there. I also want to put a little caveat in terms of I think Dr. Stone and Dr. PARRA-MEDINA mentioned like maybe having people share with you their proposals or their summary statements, meaning their review that they received. The main caveat that I want to put out there is that sometimes people are so you want to have a relationship with the person who you ask for their proposal and their summary statement, right? It's not something that you just ask a random person for, right? Because this is a lot of, hard work that somebody's put into, and sometimes they're not going to be as amenable to sharing just, with every single person. I mean, they would, but I just think it's good form to have a relationship with the person before you ask them for the proposal or their summary statement.
Although for public funding, people can do a FOIA request and request your proposal. So I have gotten requests from NIH where investigators want to see my funded proposal. And what they'll do is they'll write to you and ask if there's any proprietary information that you want to take out of your proposal. I can't say no, I don't want you to share it with them, but they do give me a chance to kind of take out anything that, I think is,
Yeah.
which none of it usually is. So, but yeah, so that you can go around. I often wonder who those people are because they never tell you who they are, but they've gone through a lot of effort to request the proposal through this process.
Yeah, you can certainly do that, and that's fine. And there should be a process for doing that, just in terms of like building rapport, community, etc. A better sort of strategy is to build relationship with the person who you're asking for these sort of materials. I
agree, absolutely.
Yeah, I would add, like, for me, for the people that I asked for, the people that I knew directly, people that like I knew, like, oh, we were on this committee like together a long time ago, right? or like, hey, I use your work, so you might be familiar with mine. Like, it wasn't usually just like a total stranger, right? But you might want to go through your social networks and be like, hey, like, I don't know anyone there's a question here about the NSF career and NIH career. Gosh, off the top of my head, I don't think I know anyone who has that. But ask your dissertation chair and ask your coworkers and see if they know someone who has, right? Because it's really different to be like, you know what, I work with your friend, and I'm applying for this too. Would you be willing to like chat with me for 30 minutes about your experience, right? Or whatever like that. There's all kinds of different ways of kind of talking to those folks, because they probably have the best perspective of like kind of what some of the current priorities are and kind of what their own experience was like applying.
And even the formula, right? Like a structure, like these are the sections. They really like it if you organize the career development plan in a table, just getting sense of how, not even the content, but sometimes just the structure and the organization also makes a big difference.
These nuances about networking and reaching out are beyond what I've heard before. So I'm feeling a lot of appreciation for this. So thank you. And being sensitive to time, I'm going to move us to our third question. So I'm going to post it in the chat and then read it. And how do we create a community of support to do this type of research? What type of organizing and advocacy should we be doing with each other and within our institutions?
I think internally it's critical, especially as we're building support and understanding and awareness of qualitative work. We also must recognize that we're in an environment, at least in the social sciences, we're in this environment where all of a sudden there's people who are publishing 20 articles a year, even 30 articles a year. And it's like, wow, that's almost, I would say, impossible to do with qualitative ethnographic work at 20 to 30. I mean, the sheer amount of time that goes into, at times one article is at a totally different sort of level than, secondary data analysis. I'm not undermining secondary data analysis. I'm just saying that with qualitative ethnographic work or any type of qualitative work, there is a lot of work that needs to be put up front to build that relationship, like we were sharing, to build those networks, right? And to really get into participatory understanding of whatever phenomena that you're trying to get at. So having said that, if you are on a tenure review committee, right, it behooves you to be part of the committee, that says, okay, well, this person may have X amount of articles, but I really want to underscore how much work they put into this particular study, right? It may not reflect this person may not have the most high numbers of publications, but let's think about the amount of time, effort, and work. And also, I think now there is, as you indicated earlier, Candice, about this level of awareness and maybe even understanding. I don't know about understanding, but level of okay, qualitative work is back, we're interested in it, but maybe there's still a gap in terms of understanding of how much time and effort it actually takes to build a solid qualitative program of research. I think that's really critical here, especially in an environment where people are just, publish, almost like publishing like factories, right? So building a culture as we move through the ranks, building a tenure process that is mindful and thoughtful and doesn't just go by numbers, not even tenure process, merit, right? Even merit, right? Like sometimes with merit, there is this sort of feeling of like, how many articles does this person have? okay, they deserve the, this person doesn't have that many articles. Well, how do you build in within the merit process a discussion of the time, effort, or something related to the articles and what it brings in? Because if you don't do that, what it does is it really disincentivizes work with hard to reach populations, right? With the pandemic and this sort of increased awareness of how health disparities are really sort of siloed within, health disparity populations, marginalized populations. We need more and more people to work with hard to reach populations, not less and less. So academia really needs to work on making sure we're not creating penalties for people who are working in this area of work.
I would add to that is to learn to speak, because I've been on the P&T 5 years and also helped colleagues kind of go up in my department. Learn to speak the language of numbers when you're talking about your own research in terms of time, right? Like, or in terms of the length of your articles, right? If I write a qualitative 10,000 word article, which is really, really common, right? Like, honestly, if I was going to go up to for P&T again in this time of like bean counting, I would put like my word count, next after each article. I'm serious, right? Like, because that's, like, they're not equivalent. It's worth like 3,000 word articles. Also, like, being really transparent. In sociology, it takes 3 months to get reviews back, 4 months usually, right? So your publication process is longer. So just being super transparent about, like, to study this population, this is all of the work I had to do to set up. This is the number of hours of meetings I went to around this. I sometimes write into these things that, like, setting up a 1 hour meeting, a 1 hour interview is 5 hours of work. It's the work of finding the person, contacting the person, showing up, doing the interview, sending it off to a transcriptionist. It's good to get funding for that, right? Of all the things, right? Transcriptionists, great. Like, that saves you so much time. And then, like, putting it, and that's before I even analyze it, right? Like, that's just doing the interview, right? So being really, really clear, if you're doing ethnography, like, what does that mean, right? If you're sending something to non-qualitative people, right? Like, this is the amount of time that it will take to get this one interview. It will take me 3 hours of fieldwork. By fieldwork, I mean going to this organization every day, going to this street corner every day, spending this many hours there, spending 40 hours of contact before I do this one interview. Like, try to enumerate some of your stuff, even though it's not numerical, right? To be just clear how much work you're doing. Keep track, not in sort of a bean counting kind of way, but like, this means something to people who, like, really care a lot about numbers. And it's also honoring the amount of work that you do, right? Like, you're doing something really important.
I do think, at least with respect to the P&T thing, is, your research statement, right? Being able, it's an interdisciplinary committee. They don't know anything about your field, likely. There might be an economist, right, that's reviewing your file. And so, your research statement is really about explaining what you do and why it's important. And of course, if you're doing community engaged work, is the impact, right? That's an important part of a public university, and its mission, its impact on the community. And I also, some of my productivity usually ties into student dissertations, undergraduate research. So, I try to present a more comprehensive view of the work and the impact.
Yeah, I think the impact is really critical here. But also, I think some of it is just the environment, right? Like, I'll tell you a recent example. I submitted a CBPR proposal, and it was for an internal university grant, but regardless, in 2018. And then somebody from that committee, and it was rejected. And then somebody from that committee followed up with me recently and said, I really think you should resubmit. Now there's, different level of awareness, and people are really into the work that you're doing. And I was like, really? Okay. And I resubmitted pretty much the same thing. I just tweaked it a little bit. and it got funded. So what changed between 2018 to now is just really the sort of, cultural environment, even within academia, about what scholarship is important, what scholarship should you give a chance to, right? And then I think finally, I mean, I know I said this earlier, but I'll say it again, is just we need to be more mindful of developing cultures that sustain community-based participatory research or participatory research, period. Because I know, and again, this was maybe, less than 5 years ago, but I know many doctoral students who have been really interested in participatory work or CVPR or any sort of community engaged type of work. And they have been discouraged by their mentors who want the best for them. But they will say, not just doctoral students, actually, assistant professors too, who will say to them, that's important work. That's really good that you want to do this, but just hold off until you get tenure, or to the doctoral student, hold off, right? So why are they saying that? They're saying that, again, because they are trying to be protective of their mentees in an environment that is very like, get the pubs out, numbers, da 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 da.
I think there's a real lack of understanding that this can lead to like really better qualitative work, right? Like, so we did for Colors of Pride, one of the first things we did is we did this big interview study. Right, so recruited 82 people to interview one summer. I had a bunch of undergrads interviewing them, and I also had some of some various kind of grad students kind of helping us out and stuff. So we did all these interviews. It was so much easier to recruit people for interviews when I had the Pride Center working. Like Pride Center would like send out emails to their whole mailing list, put it on their social media, which is already developed, right? They have all these community partners. We had this community advisory board, and they all put it in their newsletters and their social media, right? Because they had been around on the project from the very beginning. So all that time that I would have put into finding people, instead I was spending it at community advisory board meetings. And, I talked to more interesting people because of this, right? Like I had way better recruitment into that project and more community buy-in, right? Like it was better interviews. Like it can be really good research, right? So I think there's this kind of snottiness about community-based participatory research that like perhaps like it's not quite as rigorous or whatever. But honestly, if the strength of qualitative research is that we like really get to talk to people, right? Get to know them, like you just get to know more people and like deeper, I think, through this method.
Yeah, I think that's where partnering with senior scholars, I think you're a great example, Amy, right? Because you've been working with this center and this community for so long. So if there's a junior scholar who works with you, they could take advantage, right? You could facilitate things for them so they don't have to invest long-term, right? And they can maybe accomplish some things short-term, right? To begin to establish their own reputation and program, while at the same time, maybe they're nurturing their own separate relationships or that sort of thing. So I think, finding people who are open, who already have these relationships, who maybe are open to bringing you in and making those available. But, you have to have established relationships. I'm very protective, right? I've spent a lot of time investing in these communities. So I want to make sure that the approaches that people use, how they're going to engage, all that kind of aligns with my own values and approach. And so, I do serve as a gatekeeper, but at the same time, I do make it available to others.
Again, this is all excellent information. And I've sat on many panels discussing, techniques to obtain funding, but the focus on bigger picture advocacy, building relationships, this is beyond what I've heard. So I very much appreciate all of this. So we are very close to our question and answer time, but before we shift, I wonder if there's any last comments that any of you would like to share, any of our panelists would like to share.
I'm feeling very chatty today. So much of it, but I would say, in case it's not obvious, pay your community partner. Like if you get funding, your community partner needs to be paid. If you're getting paid salary, like if it's one that will fund salary, they should have a salary. They should be paid for their time. People who participate should be paid for your time. Community advisory board should be paid for their time. If it's one of those grants, some grants only fund the research activity. If so, pay for rented time in their building, right? Like have some way to pay, like if you're like, I'm gonna go, like we did interviews at the Pride Center, like pay for that time because you can count that as a research expense if it's at a grant that won't pay salary. But some money should be going back to the organization, particularly for the person's time. So when I worked with Robert in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation with Robert Salcido Jr., who at the time was he already had a full-time job. He was also a volunteer executive director of the Pride Center with the goal of him becoming funded, which has just happened this year, like 5 years in, right? We paid for him to have a part-time staff member because he needed time, right? So she could handle all, like she didn't handle a lot of project stuff. She handled all the stuff that he needed to be handling that, you know, was keeping him from doing project stuff, right? So like pay them, right? And NIH expects you to pay them. Like I put in an NIH CVPR project and they were like, why is your community partner not being paid more? And I was like, that's a good question. I should pay him more, right? So if your community partner is involved at all in the project and helping recruitment or whatever for one of those big grants, they expect you to pay them, and you should.
There's also a lot of bureaucratic hurdles working with universities and community partners. Community partners don't usually have deep pockets. And so running reimbursable grants can be problematic, but also compensating certain community groups or individuals becomes really problematic when the university is asking for, you know, social security numbers or personal information, and not to mention the time. You know, I had one community person, we were really close. She said, well, good thing I don't have to buy bread with this money, right? Because it took like almost 6 months to get her a check for the work that she did on my advisory group, right? So, I mean, she felt comfortable enough to tell me like, you know, good thing I don't need this to survive because, you know, I would, you know, be homeless by now. But so I think working also with community organizations helps with some of these challenges. They typically have a little bit more flexibility, especially with things like food, right? Feeding people at community meetings is really important. NIH doesn't fund food. So I do often budget like meeting coordination also to community-based organizations. And so, you know, that's for their space, their time, and any other things that are required for the meeting. And so these are also some maybe tricks of the trade, right? That you can get from people who've gotten funding, right? It's how their workarounds and how to make sure you get the resources where it can best be used efficiently as well.
Yeah, and my final point is that as you're thinking through building a program or research that is participatory, or even a study that's participatory, there are no shortcuts, right? There are no, let me just quickly do this and, you know, it'll be like participatory kind of. You know, I have often been asked by researchers, you know, how are you getting these men who are undocumented and working in these, you know, low-wage jobs to talk to you? How are you getting them to talk to you about the HIV risk engagement that they're involved in, or engagement and illicit drug use? And the answer is very, very simple, because we take the time to really build trust, presence, relationship, and they're really, you can't fast forward that process. That's a really, really critical piece here.
Well, this has been just incredibly valuable, a valuable discussion. I know that I personally have benefited, and I believe through the chat comments that our attendees have as well. So I Very much appreciate this discussion. It's now time for questions from the attendees and for our panelists to answer. So Dr. Emily Nicolette, my colleague, will facilitate this portion of our event. So please type your questions into the chat and Dr. Nicolette will share them with the panelists. So Emily, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Candace. So we already have several questions in the chat that I'll just begin, but I will also keep an eye out for new questions as they come up. So the first question is from Augustine about, let me see, sorry about that. It disappeared off of my screen. Let's see, what are the barriers, if any, for introducing courses in the curriculum that integrate qualitative and quantitative methods?
I taught my undergrad stats class for about 10 years as a community-based research class. For me, I had more a personal barrier of like being like, I like didn't always want to be like the big coordinator. So I ended up making, instead of having like one big project that we all did that I coordinated, I actually put them into like teams of 4 or 5. And I was like, it's your job to go meet with the community partner, which meant the projects actually had kind of variable quality, unfortunately. Like, so some of them were really amazing and some were like kind of not so great. So I think for me, like one of the biggest barriers was like resources. But I'm also somebody who like, my department doesn't have a lot of like not I don't say oversight, but they don't micromanage us a whole lot here. So they're like, oh, you want to do community-based research? That's great. But they don't necessarily give you like a course release or resources for it, right? But they're not going to stop you from doing it. So some of it's to figure out like how much time you really have, like to figure out if that's a thing that serves you, right? And also your progress and also the community organization. They might not want a bunch of like a ton of people coming in and out, you know, of that community. At the moment, I kind of have backed away from doing it within my classes. And instead I have this like 1 credit research lab. I use it as like low prep, no prep. People keep being like, you should make it a 3 credit class. I'm like, I absolutely should not. Like, I basically walk in and we do the things that need to be done on the project that week together. And students have like very minor stuff that they do in addition to that. So that's kind of how I manage part of that. But like I have done it in classes before. And the biggest burden was my own time and energy.
Yeah, I'm in a school of social work, but in general, I think what I see is there is this sort of mentality that, you know, advanced statistical methods or any statistical methods must be taught and they must be learned and they have to be, you know, there has to be room in the curriculum for it. But there isn't necessarily that same sort of sense for qualitative methods or even mixed methods, where there seems to be a sort of, you know, feeling from some that anybody can do qualitative methods, but not everybody can do advanced stats, right? And obviously that speaks to how much time and investment the curriculum is going to put into developing and training students in the rigor of qualitative, the rigor of mixed methods. And it goes back to funding. I mean, if you're trying to submit for NIH funding or NSF or whatever type of funding, where without any like actual formal training in qualitative methods or real sort of reading in it and background in it, you're not going to get it funded because people who are going to review it will clearly see that you do not have that sort of training. Being on search committees, I will share with you that, you know, a couple of searches ago, all of a sudden everybody indicated that they were mixed methods researcher, yet they were absolutely not familiar with mixed methods approaches, the sort of specific sort of methodological strategies involved in mixed methods research. But, you know, it was just this sort of like, yeah, I do mixed methods research, right? So those are major barriers for having classes in the curriculum that are specific to qualitative methods or even mixed methods?
Thank you. A second question, combining several questions. What has been your experience in getting funded by NIH as well as NSF for qualitative and community engaged research?
My experience has been that they wanted to kind of sound like quantitative research, right? You need to have a hypothesis, right? And it's okay if you're like, you're not really hypothesis driven, just learn to write that language. It's fine, right? Like, just put it out there. Like, you could be like, I'm just really open to what I'm going to find. I have some questions, right? But just be like, here's my 3 theories about what I think is going on, right? And like, get to the literature. Like, don't, try to write it it's kind of the quantification of qualitative research that we see in these grant proposals, but they really want it laid out. Like, how are you going to interview people, right? Like, are you going to go to their homes? Are you going to do it at a coffee shop? Like, how long are the interviews going to take? What are your questions? Like, if you're doing an ethnography, like, who are you going to talk to? Where are you going to go? Like, and you kind of have to make that up a little bit. Like, I mean, grants are often some fantasy work, right? Like what we think ideally we want, how we like the project to unfold, right? And that's okay. But they really want to know, like, where, if you're going to talk to people, where are you going to like get them from? And like, where are you going to talk to them at? And like, when I did an ethnography, I did a multi-site ethnography of a Mardi Gras and Fiesta. And that was just a me project, pretty much, this 5-year ethnographic project that I did. And when I wrote grants for it, I had to be very specific. I want to attend these events. I'm going to go out for like a weekend at a time. I'm going to go talk to people at parades. I'm going to do formal interviews in the summer during this period. And these are the kinds of people that I think I'm going to interview. Like, just be really, really, really specific, even if that might not be what ends up happening, right? But your vision for what that's going to be. They also want a lot of specifics about your analysis, right? I tend to be kind of a fly by the seat of my pants qualitative analysis person, because it kind of depends on what question you're asking for which paper you're writing, right? But you need to have a really clear plan, right? So make a plan, right, for like what you're going to do with this data that you don't even have yet, right? But they want to see it, because for quantitative work, they want to see it for that, right? So like, they kind of feel that way about qualitative research too. You should address some questions that are very quantitative, like generalizability of your project. It's a little painful, right? Like, I wish it wasn't the case that we had to do that, but here we are. Like, so try to think about hypotheses, to be really clear about what they are, right? And to address things like representativeness in your data analysis plan.
Yeah, I think that that's super good advice, right? You're going to have the same sections that, a quantitative or an experimental design study has. And so you have to lay out your methods, your recruitment, retention, reliability, right? Multiple coders, blinding, whatever you're going to do. And the first time I wrote as kind of a CBPR project, they came back saying that I was leaving it too much to the community. Like, you can't do that. It's like, you're the PI, you have to know what's going on, or you're the one that has to lead. And so it was kind of, this is my vision of how I think everything's going to work out, or this is kind of how I think what the stages are and how I'm going to engage. I even had to say, I think that this is what the intervention is going to look like, even though I had no clue. But they wanted me as the principal investigator to already have a sense of kind of the direction I was going and laying out a plan, but not leaving it totally in the proposal itself, saying, well, I'm going to do these processes, and after this process, this is what I expect to get. And then from that, I'm going to go to the next. It just didn't work. Maybe it's different now. That was back 15 years ago when, CBPR was barely kind of getting out there. Maybe, the reviewers are a little bit more, sophisticated now, but that was the case.
I got a similar response to a proposal I did like 2 years ago.
Yeah, and just piggybacking on what you both said, I think, again, this is where it's important to be working with people who have been funded in qualitative methods or whatever sort of specific methods you're planning to use with the specific like funder, with NIH. With NIH specifically, you know, the people that I work with are senior people who have experience, a long sort of track record of getting qualitative work funded by NIH. So they know the ins and outs. They know like, hey, this review committee is more qualitative friendly, so you should go with this review committee. This institute may be a better fit for the work that you're doing or the methods that you're interested in versus these other sort of institutes. So even details like that, because the review committee is going to make it or break your proposal, obviously, right? So if you can get insight regarding that, that's really key and important.
There is a study section at NIH that, at least there was like 2 years ago, that was more focused on community-based research.
Oh, and one more thing, just to add to, like, you know, sometimes, so I had a study that was purely ethnographic that was funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And, you know, we proposed that we were going to interview 75 Latino immigrant day laborers. We ended up interviewing 77. But, you know, the reality is, you know, you reach a point, obviously, I'm assuming most of you have taken a qualitative class, you know about the concept of saturation, right? I mean, 77 is a lot, and we did reach saturation before that.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Katie. I would love to hear more about your process for developing, generating RQs with the community.
I can give it, I guess, an example. Well, basically, it's a lot of group process for me, where we get together, you know, we discuss the topic, discuss what we all know and bring to the table. We do a lot of like concept mapping and decide what remains to be explored or what we don't know to guide us into the direction of the research. So for example, at one point I was doing a cancer prevention. There was opportunity for cancer prevention funding. And so we were already kind of meeting, and this opportunity came up. So we pulled all the stakeholders together. So there was people from community health centers, there was local people from the American Cancer Society, the state free screening program, a local interpreter who did all the healthcare interpretation, some, you know, local immigrant community-based organizations. And so we all sat together and we shared our experience in serving the community, what our expertise was, what our experiences and expertise were with the community and with the issue that we were exploring. And then, you know, what is it that we want to know, you know, and from who, and what's going to be the best way of getting that information. And really, that's how I do it, just a facilitation process and coming to a consensus.
Thank you. And I believe the RQ is research questions. Okay. Thanks. Any other responses from any of the other panelists on that question?
For me, like a lot of my research question development happened with like the leadership of the organization that I was working with. We did have a community advisory board, and people had like all kinds of different like kind of questions. So I was really centered around like the Pride Center's priorities in many ways, mostly because I saw them as benefiting the most from the research, right? And then, so we had our grant to study resilience, which we're like, okay, yeah, that's kind of interesting, you know, sure, we can do that. But on top of that was like, because that was the theme of the grant that we got from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which actually funds community-based participatory research. They have a program called Interdisciplinary Research Leaders, which is funds 1 community partner and 2 academics to work on a project for 3 years. A really, really great program. But I was like, what does the Pride Center need? And what they needed is they didn't even have any basic demographic information about who their community was and what they needed, right? So when we were like, we're going to do a big survey, of course, it's about resilience for the grant. But here's all of the questions that we need to know for the Pride Center. And the report that we made from that survey, so this isn't the qualitative part, right? But the report we made from it is really readable to like a non-stats audience and has been used by other organizations to get funding, right? So like they needed some numbers, right? So we like went and got some basic numbers for them. But we developed those survey questions by doing the qualitative research, right? By going and talking to people about their lives and seeing like what are the things that came up, what are the things we need to be asking to get numbers for. So it's kind of this kind of like complex dance in many ways, right? There are also some of my own interests for like, you know, oh, I really like to write a paper on like communities. Like we're gonna ask people about the experiences with community, right? In there too. So it ended up being kind of this like Franken questions, you know, it had some coherence to it, but like, you know, kind of have to like kind of mediate everyone's interests, you know, for it.
I did put in the chat, as Amy was talking, it reminded me that also, if you have established relationships with the community, right, you're interacting with them, you're in social spaces with them, they tell you what the questions are, right? So I was approached by a group that said, you know, they're closing down these mobile home parks for redevelopment, and we suspect that it's mostly Hispanic parks that are being shut down, but we're not really sure. How can we figure that out? And, you know, they came to me, it's like, well, okay, that's an important question. Let's figure that out. And so sometimes, you know, just being with them, working with them, these issues emerge, right? And if you're able and you have the time, energy, the expertise, or can facilitate that, that's, you know, how it works. That's at least, you know, that also is another way, I guess, that research questions emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that, you know, just even thinking through how I've built upon my program of research is, you know, in the very beginning, it's a very sort of like open-ended, you know, like how are you doing? What does well-being mean to you? And then really allowing for issues or important factors related to their health to emerge from the participants themselves rather than being driven by a priori sort of hypotheses that I may have. And then once those are emergent, then, you know, moving along accordingly. And as Deborah just mentioned too, you know, having multiple relationships, I think, is critical here. So building for my program of research, you know, I am involved in organizations that are working with day laborers, but also out in the field talking to day laborers. Simultaneously, you know, I have relationships with social service providers. So when social service providers say to me, all we're seeing are people who are in families who are not engaging in HIV risk. We're not being able to tap into single men who are living with other men and are working in day labor. How do we do that? Then it's thinking through, okay, what does that mean? What are the next steps in terms of the work that needs to be done for day laborers, because they need the services, but also, you know, being responsive to the service gaps that service providers are indicating.
Thank you so much. Candice, is there time for one more question?
Yes.
Excellent. This question is from Tess, and it's about community building. When you were new to your universities and living in a new place, what specific steps did you take to begin building relationships?
So I moved to San Antonio 16 years ago. I didn't know anyone here. My first project kind of found me. Like there was a student in my a student actually came to us and was like, look, there's all of this like controversy around like numbers and the local point in time count around homelessness in San Antonio. And so I went and I just volunteered 1 year for the count, and I decided I was going to do it as a project for my stats class that I was teaching. I was teaching undergrad stats, right? Because it's not rocket science, right? Like, it's crosstabs and t-tests. Like I bring in dice and stickers. So I got hired, even though I'm really, really qualitative, like historical comparative, right? Like that, I got hired to teach undergrad stats in my department, which is valid. So I was like, okay, like we'll start doing that. And so I became really integrated into that community. Like everyone knew who I was. Like I went to these meetings like once a month on Fridays where we were like trying to plan the annual point in time count. Like I helped them redo their survey, which is just asking really kind of survey design 101 stuff, right? And helped train people to like how to talk to people who are unhoused and ask them meaningful questions and listen. Like, so I did that for about 10 years, actually. And then they kind of phased into a new system where they were using like HMIS data and stuff instead. So my first community-based project actually just kind of came to me through a student, right? So my first LGBTQ project kind of came through a similar route because the Pride Center was being made. That was kind of my first kind of contact with them about like, you know, what can I do to help, you know, that kind of thing. So I kind of hear through the grapevine essentially. And that grapevine can be the students in your class because sometimes they're really involved in local organizations.
I think I early on talked a little bit about how when I went to South Carolina, I basically volunteered, right? I went out, I met everybody that I could, showed up at like meetings, at festivals and events, you know, tried to help wherever I could. And you know, one day, one of the CBOs came by and said, we did this HIV survey, can you help analyze it? And there were like, you know, 100 little surveys. And I said, sure. And so that's, you know, kind of where the relationship started. But when I came to Texas, it was more about leveraging other people's social relationships. So I came to a space where I had a colleague who was well integrated into the community. And so she facilitated connections with people who she had already built trust with. And so I kind of capitalized on that, right? And she introduced me, she helped me make connections. And those people thought, well, you know, we've been working with this person for a long time. She wouldn't throw somebody, you know, to us that wasn't, you know, going to be worth working with, or, you know, that sort of thing. And so that facilitated, you know, my transition when I came to Texas. So there's, I think, multiple ways, right? One is doing the work yourself from the ground up, or also, you know, collaborating with people who already have those connections and you bring kind of the expertise. And then over time, you know, your own reputation is built with that community.
Yeah, when I moved to Baltimore, just, you know, the first thing that I did is start setting up time to have coffee with faculty and staff. And even if they weren't people who were in my specific area, just having conversations with people. You never know, people have different types of social networks and connections. And through one of those conversations with somebody who was a director of our sort of like community engagement program, he connected me to different organizations and an alumni who was working at the mayor's office in, you know, what they refer to as Hispanic affairs. And so he was able to facilitate these sort of connections through alumni organizations that he had worked with. And then, you know, I just continue to cultivate those types of relationships. And then piggybacking on what Amy and Deborah also mentioned, part of it was just showing up and being present, so that so that way you're on their radar as well. I think that's a critical sort of piece to all of it. As I'm thinking that through, I do want to also say that I know this is probably another whole conversation, but it is really important as well as you're building those beginnings of relationships that you're also being valued as a partner as well. At the sort of early stages of my career, and even maybe sometimes now, although it hasn't happened recently, there were community partners that would come to me and, you know, they'd be like, let's brainstorm. And I would spend like hour and a half, sometimes even 2 hours with them thinking through a plan or strategy or assisting them. And then next thing you know, they would go with another sort of community partner from a quote unquote sexier school on the, you know, the grant or the whatever, right? So that's also like a really difficult thing to, I think, kind of navigate. But I do want to point that out, that those things happen. And if they do happen, you're not alone. It does happen. Somebody said in the chat that these sort of relationships are difficult to cultivate during the pandemic. And I absolutely agree with you. They are, because part of it is these sort of organic moments that you have with people, right? And unfortunately on Zoom, these organic moments just don't happen, right? Like when you go to a meeting and the meeting hasn't started, you just start chit-chatting, and that's what builds rapport. But on Zoom, you just get to the point, right? So yeah, that is a major, major limitation. I absolutely hear you and feel you.
Thank you. That concludes the Q&A.
I have a shameless plug.
Yes.
I put it in the chat, but the Latino Research Institute offers an intersectional qualitative research methods institute for advanced doctoral students. So you have to have already defended your proposal and have a little bit of data with you when you participate. It's in the summer. We start recruiting usually around October. Applications are due for December. But there is also another for early career faculty that's offered through the University of Maryland College Park by the Center for Race, Gender, and Ethnicity. Yeah, so actually that one's been around much longer, and mine is modeled after that one, but for doctoral students.
Those sound like amazing opportunities. So I hope folks will follow up on that. Also, early in our discussion, I posted a link to I think it's the University of North Carolina has a qualitative research summer intensive seminar. So these are great. Well, I am just incredibly grateful to our panelists for sharing their experiences and perspectives today on these topics. After sitting in on many panels about funding and research, I just feel like I've gained so much from this experience. So thank you. And I would just wish everyone to give our panelists a virtual round of applause. And everyone, thank you for being here today. I was so heartened to see so many people join us today and the thoughtful questions that you asked. So thank you, and well wishes to all of you. Take care.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you, everyone. Oh, and feel free to email me. I'll write it down in the chat if anything comes up.
So if you don't mind sharing the link to the recording once you have it, I don't know if it's going to be saved